getting more and more like the Hunger Games out there. You know, those movies and the novels they came from about a dystopian post-war America run by an utterly corrupt, all-powerful government presiding with impunity over the lives of the populations of 13 communities where starving people live as slave labour and every year must send children to fight to the death as the fodder of reality TV entertainment. The elite of the so-called capital, the seat of power, where life is altogether different, are obscenely rich, in powdered wigs and outrageous garb, caricatures of vanity and wealth, ogling the gladiatorial combat of other people's children, feigning empathy and emotion while they do so. The first Hunger Games novel was published in 2008, and the first film came about 4 years later. And they were surely meant as satirical comment on the absolute corruption indulged by the absolutely powerful. By now, I say, it's getting harder and harder to watch the real-world elite caricature politicians, billionaires, shameless movie villains, peacocking, preening and pontificating, apparently for their own amusement. How can we be expected to watch the show, have our noses rubbed in the shameless, all but declared corruption, without wondering when satirical fiction became indistinguishable from the reality we're living in or living through? Many times in recent years, I've offered my opinion that the world is held hostage by those determined to centralise power, bent on imposing an anti-human agenda, an agenda born in the main of their fear and loathing of regular people, an agenda that will lead to death on an unthinkable scale and the enforcing of lesser, hobbled lives for the rest. When I've said anti-human, I've been thinking about individual people, individual faces at threat of death or hardship. By now, my view has changed until it's humanity itself that seems to me in deadly peril. Whatever survives into the future, whatever populations persist after Agenda 2030 and the rest, may not be the humanity we've known. I'm so troubled by the plight of humanity, I bothered to look up the etymology of the word itself. Since the 14th century or thereabouts, humanity, the word, has encompassed notions like kindness, graciousness, consideration for others. It refers to life on earth, to the capacity for pity. It means the whole human race, all colours, all creeds. It's about humane conduct, it's about philanthropy, and not the faux philanthropy that only further enriches the billionaires who only give to receive, speculate to accumulate. Humanity refers to the essential quality of being human. It also takes in the thought of politeness, which is a word that comes from the jewellery trade and means to polish and complete, to make the best of something rare and precious. The sickening spectacle of what seems like real-life Hunger Games has been before us, not only, but also in gruesome, dehumanising technicolor at the Democratic National Convention. A veritable cavalcade of ghouls taking turns on stage to say things surely even they themselves can't believe, even as their lips and tongues are shaping the words. Along with every other currency, the truth is utterly devalued now. The truth is merely whatever the powerful say it is, and whatever it is today, it will likely be something else tomorrow, so pay attention. There was space and time made for the effective humiliation of President Biden. T-shirts and placards on the one hand declaring, "We love you, Joe," while the blood from his having been stabbed in the back by his own party metaphorically puddled on the floor at his shuffling feet. It's getting on for 4 years of Joe Biden's presidency, 4 years of Democratic Party government of the United States of America and of much of the world besides, to all intents and purposes, and yet one by one, the Democrat old guard seemed able to make out as though it had really been their nemesis Donald Trump in the White House all along. How else to explain why or how everything wrong, from the illegal migrants flooding across the nation's southern border, the state of the economy, the state of health, the standing of the United States in the wider world, everything is apparently still Trump's fault. How can that be if we're supposed still to believe that the truth counts for anything at all? Hillary Clinton, that bloodiest of old hawks, actually said, and I'm not making this up, that Biden had brought decency, dignity and competence back to the White House. So how come you kneecapped him then? One of the opening speakers said a Trump administration would, and again without the faintest whiff of irony, weaponise the judiciary against political opponents. This was spoken with all apparent sincerity from the heart of a Democrat Party that has jail time hanging over Trump's head, a sword of Damocles, even as her eyes blazed and her fists clenched in righteous anger. Michelle Obama actually said, with no discernible trace of irony, that Kamala Harris is, quote, the most qualified person ever to seek the office of the presidency, one of the most dignified, the embodiment of stories Americans tell each other about America. I couldn't say for sure, but I doubt if even Kamala Harris's own nearest and dearest actually believed any of that. I watched all the way to Democrat anointed and crowned candidate Kamala Harris's speech and listened to more empty promises of utopia jammed tomorrow from someone who's been in the White House for 4 years and yet done none of the things she's pledging now. All form and zero substance. A clickbait speech based on falsehoods, welcome only for the faithful, who so fear the truth they would rather stick with the lies. Any reasonable person looking on would surely draw the conclusion that the path into the future offered by the Democrats is paved only with the lies of the past. Lies and fear are all they have to offer. I challenge anyone to watch these people, maybe with the sound off, maybe with the Hunger Games on a screen alongside, and tell the difference between the two. And lest anyone might feel sorry for Biden, bear in mind a 291-page report published following work by 3 House committees alleges the Biden family and its associates are $27 million richer on account of peddling access to the so-called big guy while he was vice president to Barack Obama. Talk about elites mired in obscene corruption. It's not just the US, of course it's not, but nobody does it better. I say again that we've arrived as a species at the edge of the abyss. It's humanity itself that's teetering. We've reached a point in our journey together when we must ask, and pardon the tortured grammar, who even are we? In the Hunger Games, the poor, which is almost everyone, are daily threatened with death and starvation. Bread features as a symbol of the essential stuff of life upon which the poor must depend, the fundamental foundation. All around us are signs, intentionally placed or not, that humanity must remember fundamental things. All over the world, and here at home too, more and more people evidently feel the absence of, and therefore the need for meaning in their lives above and beyond hollow promises. Mankind cannot live by bread alone, but the elite even have their eyes on that as well. Their hands grasping after the land, the arable land. Billionaire philanthropath Bill Gates, the Bill Gates who is no farmer in the same way that he's no scientist, no virologist, no immunologist, no doctor, that Bill Gates holds well over 250,000 acres of farmland in the US. Why? He has all sorts of plans, from the food we might eat, the seeds we might sow. All across Europe, farmers are in open revolt against the elite EU intentions to force them off their land and therefore out of the business of growing food. In India, it's been reported that increasing numbers of farmers are taking their own lives out of desperation at their inability to scratch a living by growing food. Environmental activist Vandana Shiva has fought for decades to safeguard that most humble and yet that most potent fundamental symbol and promise of life, being the seed. Quote, everything comes from the seed, but we have forgotten that the seed isn't a machine. We think we can engineer life, we can change the carefully organised DNA of a living organism and there will be no wider impact. But this is a dangerous illusion, close quote. 60% of the world's seeds are sold by just 4 countries, 4 companies. The monoculture forced upon the farmers and farmland of India, seeds patented as yet more property, might be a warning of the fate awaiting all life, humanity included, in a future where technology rules and people are dispensable. This much is true not just of seeds, but of us, of humanity. Soil fertility is falling, failing all over the world. No farmers means no food means no people. The sustained and deliberate attack on humanity, what it means to be human, has come down to the most basic fundamentals of life itself, all life, as well as destroying the fertility of the soil from which comes our food. Our own natural fertility is in steep decline as well. I've lost track of how many times I've talked on here about how nation after nation across the world is failing to produce enough babies, even to keep their indigenous populations going, that one nation after another is on the path to literal extinction. And yet, back at the de facto real-world Hunger Games, while that old ghoul Hillary Clinton told her audience, straight-faced, that her own presidential hopeful Kamala Harris cares about children and families, a mobile abortion and vasectomy clinic provided by Planned Parenthood Great Rivers was doing brisk trade close by. Abortion is a controversial subject, demanding serious consideration, but it seemed hardly surprising that the presence of a mobile unit offering such services, trivialising life and death at such a time alongside such an event, drew accusations from commentators that the American political left, so-called left, is shadowed by a death cult. The only policies you hear Harris talk about are abortion and the rights of the LGBTQ lobby. Inside and outside the venue were thousands and thousands of people wearing the blue face masks, those still trapped in the COVID era. More lies. I mentioned the idea of maybe watching those political speeches alongside clips of the elites of the Hunger Games, and it might also be instructive to review images of detainees at Guantanamo Bay, those captured during the war on terror that never ends, like all wars now, and notice how blue face masks were mandatory there, part of the demoralising and dehumanising of those others the state wanted to break and brainwash into submission. Here's the thing. For so long, we've been told wrong is right, down is up, lies are truth. The DNC was slick and polished as any Oscars, and the Oscars were abandoned as fakery long ago. The hollowness, the falsehood, barefaced from the highest levels, has cut millions adrift from the truth, what humanity is. It's more important than ever that we question the script, every word, because in the real life Hunger Games, it's our lives that are being played with. My guest, my panellist, my chum, Tom Buick, with me for the duration of all of this. Tom, you've heard me bang on, I don't know how many times, about all sorts of things, but in this one, I would say basically all form and no substance at the DNC, to put it mildly. Did you buy it?
Hi Neil, good to be back on with you. I have to say, as your monologues go, that was definitely one of the more pessimistic monologues I've heard from you. Yes, it was about what's going on in American politics, but there was a lot there going back to the 14th century about human progress. And just in case anyone tuning in that thinks, the four horses of the apocalypse is about to descend on them, we're both keen historians. I do think it's just worth reminding ourselves that the last 100 years that we've lived in, objectively, economically and socially, probably one of the most progressive century for any human civilization to have lived through. And I say that in terms of, if you go back to 1209, real incomes only went up once after the Black Death in the 13th century. The population of this world has grown by 100-fold. And I just thought, listening to your monologue there, you sound a bit like Thomas Malthus, that we're about to, the world is about to...
Never let anyone imagine. I think too few people are the problem. And yeah. I would man the barricades against the Malthusians.
Good, because I think you and I, in terms of the technology, over the last sort of 50 years. 1900, the average life expectancy was 32 years old globally. It was 47 in the United States and Britain. So you and I wouldn't be around if we were just here 100 years ago.
Look at the changes now so fast, Tom. Look at what's happened so quickly in terms of loss of liberty, loss of freedom, contraction of rights, and the demonising of world population. One powerful, strong voice after another says there's too many people. And Agenda 2030 is the only way to save the planet. And to hell with the people that have to be sacrificed along the way.
Just briefly coming back to then the Democratic National Convention point, I agree. Anyone who's tuned in over the decades to these conventions, both for the Republicans and for the Democrats, they are showbiz par excellence. There's nothing new about that. But I think what you're really getting at, and this is something we've discussed on the show and you have with your guests many, many times, is there's a sort of crisis really in our liberal democratic polis and in our elites. We were brought up to believe that those who we put into power serve us, and if we don't like what they do, we can get rid of them. And when you look across the pond, as indeed here we had with our recent general election, the reason why people talk about uni-parties, or as also described as two sides of the same backside, shall we say, in terms of our politics. People are frustrated that they don't have the kind of agency that they thought they believe they have by exercising that choice at the ballot box.
But don't you think, to me it seems there's a shift again, where we all know, we grew up knowing that politicians would say anything and sell their granny for tuppence to get into power. That's not new. But I think it almost feels now as though the people, the camps, the bases of be it Republican or Democrat, Labour or Conservative, are actually buying into the fact that they're being lied to. And that we've actually been, or so many people have been trained not to care that you're being lied to.
But you look at our political class across the West, they don't trade anymore on big visions and big ideas about where they want to take the population and take the country. If you think about even our recent past, you know, the welfare state, people can disagree with whether it's effective or not, but it was a brilliant vision to get rid of ignorance, squalor, poverty.
The welfare
John F.
state
Kennedy
had people at heart. Agenda 2030 has the planet and the future at heart.
Yeah, because, again, it's back. I mean, frankly, I would argue some of those people are very Malthusian in their view about the future of the world, because, you know, they treat climate change, the so-called climate emergency, again, like the four horses of the apocalypse. And, you know, we're all going to sort of collapse in a heap of a boiling planet tomorrow. And that is not the case, even when you look at the scientific data. But I'm back to this sort of idea that, you know, we no longer have political leaders who can give us a sense of what will life be like for me and my children and my grandchildren in 10 years' time. Name me a single politician that you listen to that gives you that kind of vision.
But I think they don't care that we know that they are lying, which I find most troubling of all. We're on to the first break, after which I'll be speaking with Andrew Doyle, GBNews' own Andrew Doyle, about whether there is an ongoing erosion of freedom of speech in Britain. You're watching The Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Welcome back to The Neil Oliver Show. Now, let's talk about free speech, and I'll make no bones about it. It's something that's very close to my heart, and it's a topic that I often try to grapple with on here. My next guest is GB News presenter, host of the show Free Speech Nation, Andrew Doyle. And Andrew has by now spent years discussing, debating, cogitating and arguing about this important topic. Thanks very much for joining me, Andrew.
Thanks for having me, Neil.
I listened again. I listened for the second time to a speech that you gave, I think at one of the Oxford colleges, I'm not quite sure, and it was about freedom of speech. And you cited Milton and Paradise Lost. I wonder if you could just develop that thesis a little bit for us just now.
Well, the reason I was talking about John Milton is because people obviously know him for his poetry for Paradise Lost, one of the greatest epic poems in the English language. But he also wrote a very important tract on freedom of speech called Areopagitica, which was a response to the state attempting to license, as in censor, all printed publications. The idea was that all printed publications would have to pass by the state. And he was effectively writing a treatise on freedom of the press and, by extension, freedom of speech, full stop. And he made lots of terrific arguments about why freedom was so important and why liberty generally is so important. And I was talking about that because I wanted to explain that there's been a long history of great thinkers in this country attempting to defend free speech, and that actually you don't have free speech and then you've got it forever. Every successive generation has to keep on arguing it. And that's why I like to draw on thinkers such as Milton or John Stuart Mill, who have done this, who've been here before. And from what's happening at the moment in this country, we have to have these arguments again. I don't think it's ever been more urgent.
I also, in preparing to talk to you, I re-listened to Rowan Atkinson's, what I thought was an excellent 10 minutes that he gave relatively recently, touching on many things about the crucial importance of freedom of speech. But he also made a point of saying that there must be freedom to be offensive, which I thought was, well, yeah.
Absolutely. So the major problem that we face at the moment is that there is a new ideological movement whose core belief is that language shapes our perception of reality, and therefore you need to curb language that can cause offence. And the idea is that words and violence are effectively therefore the same thing. And that's an ideology that has caught on in all major political parties, and it needs to be challenged. Because, I mean, this is, I think, what the current Labour government are doing in terms of their crackdown on free speech. You know, a lot of the people tweeting and posting things on social media are saying really vile things. But there is an assumption that those vile things incite violence, lead to violence, that words and violence are the same. That assumption has been tested over many decades of research. It's called media effects theory. We know that the public doesn't, in fact, act on cue to the words that they read online. It's simply not true. There's no evidence for it. And that really disturbs me. So I think we need to have a serious conversation about this assumption that there is a causal link between people saying horrible things, which is the price you pay for free speech, and actions that are taken by people who read those things.
Now, as you say, Andrew, there is a long history of people seeing the need to challenge any threat to freedom of speech. But nonetheless, it keeps on happening. And at the moment, as you rightly touch on, this idea of people being jailed, given substantial custodial sentences for posts on social media. And so clearly there is, I wonder if our generation's fight for freedom of speech, and you've been you're a principal campaigner in all of that, flagging up the threat to freedom of speech. It feels as if we're just losing the battle, that we're clearly not doing enough.
I think part of the reason we're losing the battle is that this is not a left-right issue anymore. I think the Conservatives implemented a lot of policies and laws that I deem to be threatening to our liberty. For instance, they introduced the Police Crime and Sentencing Bill, where they wanted to give the police the power to arrest protesters if they were noisy, which, of course, most protesters are. And then you had the Online Safety Bill, which was a Conservative legislation, which now the Labour Party are revamping. They're making it even more draconian than it currently is. And as you say, we seem to be losing it because successive governments across the world, particularly the Western world, are implementing the most draconian hate speech measures. We've seen it with the hate speech bill in Scotland. Ireland actually has a definition in its new bill, its proposed bill. The definition of hatred is hatred. So it's a completely circular definition, which of course can be applied and exploited by any future government. And this is the key question that I think people aren't reckoning with. We see these horrible things online and we think, oh, I just want those to go away. I wish the people who said that, they're obviously repugnant people. So what's wrong if we lock them up? But you're asking the wrong question there. The question that you should be asking is, which is preferable? Which is safer? Having a society in which people are free to say whatever they want, and that includes people saying really, really despicable things, on the one hand, or on the other hand, empowering the state to imprison its citizens because of what they say. And anyone who knows anything about history will know about the dangers of that latter option. That's the argument that we need to be having. It's not the argument that we are having.
Tom Buick with me in the studio here. What is it sinister? Is it sinister, this, that despite all our efforts on here, and many people, Andrew Doyle, lots of people all around the world are flagging the threat to freedom of speech, and yet there's this constant pressure upon that precious freedom?
Absolutely. And I mean, Andrew hit the nail on the head when he said we're not necessarily asking the right questions around this debate. I mean, as someone that's obviously from the education world, I'm very disturbed by what Bridget Phillipson, the new Secretary of State for Education, has done by, in effect, suspending a law that was going to come in to protect free speech on campus. Again, where's her evidence that this is going to be a burden on higher education? All we're asking for is to ensure that academics are not hounded out of their jobs, either by other academics or more likely by students, because of legal opinions that they hold. And what I struggle with this debate, because I would describe myself as a free speech advocate, not necessarily a free speech absolutist. In other words, I do think there's a concept of a limit to free speech. So, I'm interested, Andrew, in what your view is on that.
Free speech. I think.
Happy with
Go on,
to
sorry,
respond
Neil.
to that, Andrew?
Yes, I do think that I am a free speech absolutist, I think. You could say that incitement to violence would be the exception to that. But I think you need to hold the threshold for that extremely high. In America, they have the Brandenburg test, and that was established by the Supreme Court in 1969. That was when you had the conviction of a KKK leader, Clarence Brandenburg. That was overturned because it was deemed that the language he used didn't, in fact, incite violence. And the test ever since that landmark case has been that the words that are uttered have to be intended to incite violence, likely to incite violence, and also that any possible impact has to be imminent. Now, the only kind of situation where that would work is with a demagogue standing in front of a crowd, whipping them up, and then pointing at an individual and saying to his followers, "Kill him now." That's about the threshold of this. You could say that someone posting online saying, "Go and smash up a hotel," is incitement to violence, but there is no evidence whatsoever that anyone who then goes and smashes up the hotel did so, were acting on cue from that statement. In fact, all the evidence says that's not the case. And actually, the responsibility for criminal activity should be with those who perform the criminal activity, not those who merely talk about it. So I would say we need complete freedom of speech, even for ghastly people who say ghastly things, because that is preferable to the alternative. Because every tyrannical regime in history has said that they are implementing censorship for the safety of citizens. Everyone's done it. And now we have a government that's talking about its online safety bill, and it wants to, because it doesn't just stop, by the way, with incitement to violence or horrible things said online. It soon expands. This is something that actually Milton talked about. It soon expands into opinions that the government doesn't like. If you have something on the statute books saying that hatred is illegal, hate speech is illegal, what is to stop a future government deciding that criticism of their policies is hatred, and therefore using that legislation to oppress its citizens?
I'll have to jump in there, Andrew Doyle. Clearly, the fight for free speech is a war without end. Thanks for that. Thanks for your insight. Thanks for raising the bar, bringing John Milton and Paradise Lost into this studio, if only briefly. Thank you, Andrew Doyle. After the break, former Conservative and UKIP MP Douglas Carswell will join me to discuss whether we're seeing a spiralling of anger across the UK. I think we are. The question is, who's driving it? Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. Next, I want to discuss the anger that we see all around us in the public square in relation to riots, which have been all across the country, and to ask what it shows about whether there's a deep-rooted frustration amongst the public. I would say there certainly is, and the question I'm particularly interested in is who's driving it. Joining me to discuss this is former Conservative and UKIP Member of Parliament Douglas Carswell. Thank you for joining us from Mississippi.
Hello, lovely to be on your show. Thank you for having me.
No, it's a pleasure to hear from you. I'd like really simply to kick off by having you give us your take on the clearly spiralling unrest up and down the country, north and south, east and west. What's your interpretation of it?
A lot of it is justified anger because the British people have been lied to systematically. They've been lied to over immigration, both about the numbers and about the consequences. On numerous occasions, the British people have voted to reduce mass immigration. They did so in 2010, they did so in 2015, they did so in 2017, they did so in 2019. And far from controlling immigration, the Conservative government allowed immigration to get out of control, to the point where today in Britain, 1 in every 27 people has arrived in the past year. The year to date from June 2024, the previous year, the government allowed in over 1.1 million long-term settlers through the visa scheme. And that's only legitimate legal migration. That's not even taking into account the large-scale illegal migration such as that comes across the channel every day. So I think there is justifiable anger that the composition of the country is being changed demographically in a very short space of time. Now, the second great lie about immigration is that immigration is a benefit. Now, immigration can be a benefit. I myself am talking to you from the United States, where I'm a migrant, I should say, a legal migrant. Legal migration can be very beneficial to a country. But you need to take into account not only the skills and the net value of the migrants, you need to take into account questions of cultural compatibility. And the truth is that if you accept large numbers of people into the country who have values that are not Western, that have values that conflict with Western assumptions about knowledge and the role of orthodoxy in society, you're creating long-term division in society And people know this, and they can see the evidence with their own eyes, and they're fed up with it. They've been lied to. And I think the anger is really fueled by the idea that somehow there's something illegitimate and untoward and immoral about them complaining about this.
Douglas,
I think people have every right to feel angry.
I agree. I agree that the anger is wholly understandable, but I'm also sensitive to the reality that everyone on the move is a pawn on the board to some extent. You know, that people are moving for all sorts of complicated reasons, many of which are beyond their control, or they've been driven to move by circumstances at home and all of the rest of it, which is why I'm always haunted by this idea that the trouble is not incidental, it's not accidental. That I wonder at the extent to which the chaotic consequences are desired by those who would change society fundamentally.
Are you suggesting that there's deliberate intent on the part of those who want de facto open borders?
The all people, black, white and brown, every creed, all the people are on the move, and they are all to some extent, they are being moved. They are being disturbed back at home. And there are many reasons why people are on the move. But I wonder if there is an element of, cui bono, who benefits from the chaos, because the chaos is avoidable, and that the chaos is happening, and was foretold for decades, that we find ourselves living with the consequences of that chaos now. I think it's legitimate to ask the question: well, is that chaos being foisted upon people?
I don't think it's intentional. I think the stupidity and the naivety of Western elites in believing in cultural relativism is the root cause of the problem in terms of why we can't get to grips with migration. It's not quite true that, there are tens of millions of people around the world who would like to come and live in the West. And there are tens of millions of people around the world who've got very good justification for wanting to abandon their rather horrible lives in tyrannical third world countries and want to move into the West. But we simply can't accept them all. We cannot be a lifeboat for everyone in the world who wishes to come here because they've got a horrible government. If you were to accept people simply because they're looking for a better life or trying to escape from tyranny, the West would become unrecognizable in a very short space of time. It's also not quite true to say that people from all backgrounds are moving. What's happening is people from non-Western societies are trying to get into Western societies. And I think this gives a lie to the Western elites' idea that somehow all cultures are the same. No, clearly people are voting with their feet and leaving those parts of the world that have bad political cultures, that produce bad outcomes, and they're moving to Western and, I would say, Anglosphere societies. There's a reason why people are moving from France to the UK, because Western and particular Anglosphere culture is more conducive to a happy, successful life. I think we need to recognise.
Bear with me, Douglas. Tom Buick in the studio. Do you accept that stupidity and naivety are enough of an explanation? This is a tsunami that's been building for a long time. Do you agree with Douglas Carswell that it's just been generational naivety?
There's no doubt our political class has lied to us over the last 2 decades about migration. I think Douglas is absolutely right on that. I think where I sort of depart from his narrative, and actually people who are generally perceived to be on the right of this debate, is I don't think all the explanations are purely cultural. I think they're also economic, in the sense that, take this country, why actually have successive Conservative governments not been able to bring net migration down? Why? Because we have a Treasury orthodoxy that prizes labour supply as a means of growing labour supply to grow the size of the cake, GDP. In other words, we've got governments, successive governments, that are not interested in growing the productive capacity of the British people, ensuring that they get a fair wage from the profits that get produced for our companies. They're on the side of big business often, and employers generally, who can see the benefits of, frankly, what's known as global labour arbitrage, where effectively you hold down the real incomes of people in this country and in other Western countries in that way. So I look at this more through an economic lens than a cultural lens, because someone that's lived all over the world, I think in general, people of all cultures, faiths and creeds do want to live side by side with their neighbours.
Douglas Carswell, do you see the merit of Tom Buick's economic emphasis in addition to
I think,
the point that you were making about culture and so on?
I think Tom makes a very good point and adds a further layer of explanation, and I think he's absolutely right. If you look at the atrocious productivity growth in Britain over the past 20 years, part of it is because, as he says, big business, big corporate interests in the Treasury have wanted to import cheap labour into this country. And during the referendum campaign on Brexit, interestingly, the leader of the Remain campaign at one point came close to admitting that if Britain were to leave the European Union and limit immigration, it would be a bad thing, he suggested, because big business might have to pay British workers more. So I think we can clearly see corporations and the Treasury have an interest in importing cheap labour, undoubtedly. But I don't think we can separate the economic from the cultural. I would argue that actually economic success is contingent upon cultural variables, and there's a reason, not all cultures are the same, and not all cultures are capable of producing successful free market economies, and that you can't ultimately separate out the economic from the cultural. But I don't disagree with much of what Tom says.
Douglas Carswell, I'm just running short of time right now, but you're going to be joining us to pick up and to develop this conversation in the online continuation of this show. But thank you very much for the contribution you've made so far, and I'll look forward to picking the conversation up a little bit later. Another break, after which US podcast host Kim Iverson will join me to discuss the US Democratic Convention, the spectacle that was. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. It's now time to allow our eyes to be drawn, like those of magpies, to that bright, shiny, sparkly thing that was the DNC, the Democrat National Convention. Another healthy dose of US politics. And for that purpose, I'm joined by US podcast host Kim Iverson. Kim, are you there? I mean, where do we begin? What did you make of the whole spectacle in its entirety as a piece?
Well, it was a spectacle. That's a great way to phrase it, that it was just a giant, sparkly spectacle, because there was really no purpose to it except to fundraise, except to rally the troops, the Democratic voting troops. That's what it was about. This wasn't an actual convention where where people actually cast their votes and a candidate is selected. This was all ceremonial. Kamala Harris was already, they did the vote a couple of weeks ago during a virtual roll call. So this was all just pomp and circumstance at this point. So it was just a way to fundraise. That's what they were doing. They were trying to present their vision for America. Their vision was, we don't want Donald Trump. It's pretty much the same vision that they've been presenting since 2016. So nearly 10 years now of, we just don't want Donald Trump. We're not going back, was the message.
Which I thought had a strange ring and cadence to it somehow, this we're not going back. But I was struck particularly by the way in which you would have imagined, you'd have been forgiven for thinking that Kamala Harris was speaking as someone trying to oust an incumbent president. It was as though she wasn't in power and was trying to get into power. And you think, well, apart from 4 years, for the last 12 years, you guys have had all the levers of power.
Right. Yeah, they're very much still running on, we have to defeat Donald Trump. And so they are, rather than focusing on their own record, but you could understand why they wouldn't be. Their record does have, it's a bit spotty, and it's not exactly something that people can point to. Now, in fairness, and I'm not a fan of either party, quite frankly, but in fairness, I do think that the future will kind of tell what happened during the Biden administration. I think a lot of the policies that Biden and Harris well, actually, I don't even know. I would say it was Biden, but I'm not actually sure who's been running the government for the last 4 years. But the policies that they implemented, I don't think we're going to see the fruits of those labors until way later. And I'm meaning the infrastructure projects that might actually end up being beneficial for America. But a lot of the other stuff, the stuff that's imminent, the stuff that we can point to that has immediate consequences, have been not so great. The economy is not doing well, even though they're trying to claim that it is. Crime rates are up, even though they're trying to claim crime rates are down. We have massive inflation. They're trying to tell us everything's just fine. There's a lot of them telling us things are fine, don't worry about anything. But the reality for Americans is we're seeing the changes with our own eyes. We're experiencing it in our daily lives. So their record right now is not that great. So you could understand why they would instead run on rather than, hey, look, in 10 years, you might see those infrastructure projects that we implemented. That's not really something to run on. Instead, they have to say, we've got to defeat Donald Trump. He's the bad guy. But you're right. It sounds like he's the one who's been in power, according to them, and why things are so bad. And they're going to turn things around.
What did you make of the commentators on the mainstream, in large part, who seem to be parroting this notion that it was about vibes and not policies? Which, when you're talking about someone coming in to be the leader of the free world, that it's just vibes and no policies. Are you serious?
Yeah, it's all joy. It's just joy. Everybody's joyful. This is all joy, is what we keep hearing over and over again. It is almost like a gaslighting campaign rather than actually focusing on policies. Harris hasn't put forward really any policies. She did mention a couple of policies. Those have been ridiculed, things like price controls. But otherwise, there have been no real policies put forward. It's just, we don't want Donald Trump. We're not going to go back to the years of Donald Trump. But Americans were actually prosperous in the years of Donald Trump. So a lot of Americans want to go back to that. They say, all right, I put up with the guy. He might tweet some weird things here and there, and he might be crass, but at least my life was better, and I wasn't experiencing the type of struggling that I'm experiencing now. So Americans are feeling the struggle. And yet Harris is trying to tell us, and the Democrats and all the pundits, I mean, they've all rallied around Harris. It was the biggest coup. I mean, we experienced a coup in this country straight, plain and simple. It's like they took Joe Biden out back and they put him out to pasture, and they brought in Harris, and they're claiming to be the party of democracy. No one cast a vote. No one's voted for Harris. No one's ever wanted her to be president, or even the nominee for that matter in 2019, 2020 when she was running. No one voted for her. She had to drop out of the race. And here we are. And
the astonishing alchemy of the most unpopular VP and most unpopular president, side by side, and yet within a matter of days, this alchemy has made it appear that Kamala Harris walks on water. It's a wondrous thing to behold. She's now of messianic potential.
Well, this is what manufactured consent looks like. I mean, we are watching in real time what propagandizing a group of people looks like. And people, I don't know if people are buying it. I have to be honest, I'm not sure if people are really, truly buying it, or if they're just being told over and over, Harris is the one, she's amazing, everybody's joyful, look at all the money we're fundraising, everybody's very excited about this candidate, everybody wants this presidency, she's got all the credentials and the experience, and really, she doesn't. I mean, as vice president, what does a vice president even do? So, this is what propagandizing and gaslighting, propagandizing and manufactured consent. This is exactly what it looks like. And it's something it's a sight to behold. There's no doubt about it.
It's a sight to behold. Kim Iversen, you're going to stay with us. You're going to go into the second hour. We're going to pick up this conversation. But if you bear with me just while I make that transition, that's it for the TV hour of the Neil Oliver Show. But please stay tuned. Up next on your channel will be the brilliant Free Speech Nation. But coming up in the next hour, I'll be going in depth with US politics with Kim Iversen. We'll be discussing the spiralling anger again in the United Kingdom with Douglas Carswell, and lecturer and commentator and thinker Ralph Schulhammer will join me to discuss the concept of moral licensing. And Tom will be picking up on all of that also. You're watching the Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Good evening, welcome along to the Neil Oliver Show on GB News, TV, radio and online. US podcast host Kim Iversen will join me to discuss the US Democratic Convention in Chicago. Kamala Harris promising a new way forward, whatever that means. I'll be joined by former Conservative and UKIP MP Douglas Carswell to discuss why we're seeing so much anger across the country and how we get out of it. And soon it'll be hammer time as lecturer, commentator and thinker Ralph Scholhammer joins me to discuss the concept of moral licensing. I'm joined now by US podcast host Kim Iverson. Kim, are you still with me?
I'm here. Thank you so much for having me.
There's so many things to choose from, really. It's a veritable cornucopia of fascinating items. But can I direct you perhaps to Michelle Obama, declaring that, or rather that commentators were saying that Michelle Obama's speech was the best speech they've ever heard at any point in the history of presidential type speeches. How do we get there?
That's interesting that they would say that. I thought her speech was good. I thought everybody spoke well. I mean, it's a DNC convention. They have prepared speeches. They have speechwriters. So, of course, all the speeches are going to be decent. Whether or not they have substance is another question. Michelle Obama's speech was great. She talks about her childhood, about her struggles. She talked about Kamala Harris having a similar background, coming from working class family, her mom coming over from India, raising her, and then Kamala Harris going to a historically black college, graduating, going and becoming a prosecutor. So she kind of highlighted and I feel like painted the picture of who Kamala Harris is when she was growing up, how she got to how she became a prosecutor, how she became who she is today. So, I thought it was nice to know all of that stuff. But again, there's a lot of people with that background. So what qualifies you then to become president of the United States is the question.
Tom Buick here in the studio with me in London. Obviously, I'm dripping with cynicism about politics in general and perhaps about the Democrats in particular. But what was your take, of what you saw, what you were invited to digest of the Democratic Party right now?
Neil, Kim's got a great take on American politics. I'm not much of a fan either of the two main parties in America. But of course, unlike Kim, I don't have a dog in the fight in terms of a vote come November the 5th. Look, as Kim said, this is what you see in politics on both sides of the pond, actually, at these major rallies and conferences. So in that sense, I didn't see anything new. But really, what struck me about it, and as someone that has been an observer of American politics over the years, is, in the back of my mind, I think, here's a country that was famous for the space race, for great society. I didn't agree with Reaganomics, but you could argue that he won the Cold War and the Berlin Wall came down. At every single juncture in American politics, it wasn't just about the looking back. There was always something about looking forward, both in terms of America's leadership in the world, but also, importantly, the message for its own domestic population. I didn't see any of that. I didn't hear any of that. And frankly, I don't hear it from the other side either, from Trump. It to me seems to be, well, one's the prosecutor, he's the bad guy, I'm going to get him in jail. And the other one's, well, she's useless, look what she's achieved, nothing as the vice president. Why would you put her in the Oval Office? That's kind of how the narrative feels to me at the moment.
Kim, I was also struck, I wonder what your take is on, I really felt there was just a rolling out of old lies, to be quite honest. Through the piece, from various people touched on various things like there was mention of an armed insurrection on the Capitol building, incited, sent by Donald Trump. It was stated as fact that he was the author of the 2025 agenda, which even I think CNN fact checkers debunked that. But all the way down the line, it was a litany of lying. That lies don't seem to matter. The truth doesn't seem to have any currency.
Yeah, isn't that ironic that the party that claims they're the ones fighting misinformation, they're the ones who are fighting for democracy, they're the party that's actually peddling the misinformation, and where's the democracy? They just literally took the guy out of office in a coup who we voted for and instilled somebody no one voted for, and are trying to tell us that this is our choice. They are lying quite a bit about a lot of these things when it comes to Project 2025. Trump has even condemned that. January 6th, the insurrection, that they continue calling an insurrection. Nancy Pelosi harped on that quite a bit during her, and then in fact, that was her entire speech. She made it a parable. She said that, January 7th, our flag was still there, making it sound like Donald Trump and his followers were trying to literally ruin the country in some sort of a revolution. That's the only thing that they have to run on. It's really unfortunate. When you go back to 2016, both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump were actually running on a path forward platforms. They were both kind of make America great again sort of platforms. I mean, Bernie didn't use that slogan, but it was a very similar, we've got to build back the working class. These are the things that we need to do in order to make the middle class healthy, protect American industry. There was a lot of that talk in 2016. Then all eyes just turned on this evil man, Donald Trump. We have to get rid of him. And that has really, I think, warped the entire political discourse. And unfortunately, Republicans have also fallen victim to that, where they now are the perpetrators of it. They were the victims. The Democrats were going after Trump. We don't like this guy, going after him every which way they can with multiple impeachments, multiple lawsuits, all these lies of insurrections. And now the Republicans have gone on defense, which they shouldn't do. They should just focus on the path forward and ignore the chatter coming from Democrats, continuing to make them look foolish. But instead, they've engaged in it. And now we're not seeing it's all Democrats saying they're criminals and Republicans saying they're using lawfare against us. And that's kind of what we've now reduced our politics to right now. And I don't know when or how we get the discourse back on track.
Kamala Harris touched in her speech on the need for unity, which is true. And she said that she, as they always do, that she was going to be a president for all Americans, for every American. And yet, almost in the next breath, she shook the jar of ants again and raised these spectres like the so-called insurrection and everything else, baiting the other side. It seems to me there's a yawning open goal for a statesman-like leader and speaker to genuinely reach across to the other side and say, we've seen what have been the consequences of this kind of partisan hate-baiting politics. Let's put it in the past and let's come together. And yet, she didn't do it, not with any real meaning.
No, she wants to be the president for everybody, so as long as everybody's going to fall in line. What's going to be interesting is what happens later on today. Donald Trump is at a rally in Arizona. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is rumored, very strong rumors, that he's going to be dropping out of the race and he's going to be forming sort of a unity government with Donald Trump. And that is what they are talking about, is bridging the gap between left and right, Kennedy being historic family from the Democrat side. So we'll see maybe a shift when it comes to those two joining forces, possibly.
Tom, there's no doubt about it, that would be a very interesting prospect, would it not? If two individuals as different as Donald Trump and Robert Kennedy Jr. agreed some kind of, entente cordiale.
I mean, I don't know the detailed psephology around it. I mean, Kim might be able to shed more light on where Kennedy's polling numbers were, but I think when I last looked at this, there was something like 6% that was saying they would turn out for him in November. So, of course, any kind of, given how we know how close the race is in terms of the current polls, anyone knows anything about American politics knows it's all about the Electoral College and about the swing states. So it'd be interesting, perhaps Kim's got a perspective on this in terms of the impact of the Kennedy vote, particularly in those swing states. I mean, that's where it could be won or lost, of course.
Kim, that really would be something to watch, wouldn't it? If that Kennedy was to endorse Donald Trump, that would really be setting the stage for something fascinating.
Yeah, for him to not take his supporters and say, hey, listen, guys, we're dropping out of the race. Let's go and support Kamala Harris. But instead to jump to the other side and say, we're going with Trump instead. We have to stop a Harris presidency. That would be quite historic. And that is what the plan is today, is that they join in on that. I'm not sure if I trust the polls at all here in the United States. I think that they're another arm of the propaganda machine. So I'm not sure if I trust that Kennedy's are as low as 6%. I would say maybe people would, I think his popularity is a lot higher than that. There might be quite a few people who are worried about a Harris presidency. And so they say, well, I'd rather vote for Donald Trump. So if they're being asked which of the candidates are you going to actually vote for, Kennedy wouldn't be the one that they actually vote for, even if they do prefer him. What we are hearing from a lot of people is, well, I would vote for Kennedy, but even then, 6% is, like you said, this is a very close race, and 1 or 2% will definitely swing it in those swing states. So if Kennedy does grab his voters and say, listen, this is why we're going with Trump, because he's going to let us actually be part of the government and make the change that we're advocating for, I think there would be a lot of people who had never voted for Donald Trump who would suddenly vote for Donald Trump, myself included, possibly. I've never voted for Donald Trump, but this election has definitely me thinking otherwise. So I'm definitely not alone. So there's a real possibility that things swing towards Trump this time around.
If you were advising the Trump campaign, how would you tell them to respond? What would you and is it the case, as the mainstream is saying, that the Trump campaign has lost momentum? What would be your advice?
Well, I would say, had I been advising them, I would have told Donald Trump to make Robert F. Kennedy Jr. his vice president pick. I also would have told Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to accept that. On numerous occasions, I actually did put that message out there to the Kennedy campaign that they should seek that appointment with Trump and go in that direction rather than continue their campaign. So I think that ticket would have been amazing. Obviously, that's not the case anymore. Now with Donald Trump, I think the best thing for him to do is, I think he's got to get rid of a couple of his campaign managers and start focusing less on one of the things that they've kind of pinpointed on Kamala Harris is the fact that she's a childless woman who's worked her way up. And there's a lot of rhetoric around that. And that's just turning women voters off, and they need those female voters. So I would say to the Trump campaign, definitely start talking about unity with all Americans from all sides of the aisle who want to move the country forward. That is 100% the message. They've got to get it back on track. It just can't be about Trump and the persecution, which has been a legitimate persecution against him. He's been legitimately persecuted, but he's got to focus on actually moving the country forward.
The magical transformation of Kamala Harris in the polls, and you can sense the way in which the mainstream media are absolutely salivating at this, the fresh hope that into which she has been transformed. Is it believable? Is it what the people are actually saying? And has the initiative really been stolen from Trump's campaign now, or is that just part of the narrative that's being portrayed to say he's dead in the water?
I think it's more shock than anything. I think people are very enthralled with what's happening on the Democratic side, not because they're just enthusiastic and there's joy, but because it's a spectacle. It was a coup. They took the president of the United States out and they told him, you cannot run, otherwise we're going to 25th Amendment you. And then they just instilled this person that nobody voted for. So I think people are more curious, enthralled. Of course, the mainstream media is very much on the Harris train. They were part of the coup. The mainstream media got together. They ganged up on Joe Biden, and they were part of it. So they're all part of this. So I just think that this is everybody's just curious. But I think the minute she starts talking, it's going to be very similar to what happened to her when she was running in the primary back in 2020.
Tom, I felt you had a response that you wanted to make to some of what Kim was saying.
Well, I mean, it's just really this terminology coup. I think that's a bit of a stretch in terms of, clearly Biden is still the 46th president of the United States. He is the guy in charge. You say that nobody voted for Kamala Harris. Well, she was on the ticket with Biden back in 2020 as the vice president. If something were ever to happen, of course, now to Biden in office, she would constitutionally take over as president. So I think absolutely, Kim, backroom dealings, shenanigans, skullduggery has gone on to remove Biden, who frankly, doesn't really have the capacity to serve another 4 years as a US president. It's not necessarily a political point. I think that's just any objective view of the state of his health and cognitive ability. But what I find kind of interesting really about Harris is, who is she in terms of the narrative that's being pinned on her? Is she this empty vessel? A lot of people are going after that idea, the social climber, someone that's just basically managed to claw her way up in American politics. Or is she this sort of rabid, radical left communist. This is another narrative that you also hear about her. But that suggests if she's the latter, then she's got some ideology, she's got some doctrine, she's got some ideas, whereas the former, she's just an airhead.
Yeah, I think it's the former, unfortunately, and not the latter. I don't think that Kamala Harris has any real ideas or policies. Otherwise, she would have put them forward by now. The right wants to paint anybody that they don't like as a radical leftist. It's just a slur they can easily use to scare their base. But Kamala hasn't really shown being radical in any way other than just not being a Republican. She certainly doesn't really show that she has any ideas. The thing about Kamala Harris, though, going back to the coup comment, Joe Biden did not want her to be vice president. He was really pressured into that. She was the one who called him basically a racist during the 2020 primary. Kamala Harris is backed by the entire Hillary Clinton apparatus. Joe Biden wasn't. Joe Biden just ended up being the guy that they went with when it came to 2020. But Kamala Harris was where they actually put all of their eggs into the Kamala Harris basket until she started to falter. And that made the big money machine, the Clinton money machine around Harris scramble. Biden has more of the Obama money machine. So these are two camps that are directly at odds within the Democratic Party. And ultimately, in the end, they decided that they wanted somebody else they could control. Kamala Harris is more under control of the Clinton camp than anything, and they wanted somebody else they could control. They could control Joe Biden, and now they're going to be able to control Kamala Harris, but it's just going to be a slightly different faction of the Democratic Party.
Fascinating and troubling days for the Republic, depending on your point of view. But Kim Iverson, it's always a pleasure to hear you. I hope we'll have the opportunity to have your insights at some point in the very near future. Thank you for joining us this evening. After the break, former Conservative and UKIP MP Douglas Carswell will join me to discuss why we're seeing so much anger across the UK. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show, and an opportunity to continue and develop the discussion around so much of a febrile atmosphere in the United Kingdom of Great Britain at the moment. I'm joined by former Conservative and UKIP Member of Parliament Douglas Carswell. Thank you for joining me once again, Douglas.
Thank you, Neil. It's good to be back.
I wonder, are we reaping the harvest? Are we bearing the consequences of decades of education and I would say propaganda around the idea that everything about British culture, British history, Britain's role in the world and in history has been only shameful, only something to set aside? Is that part of why we have then a culture into which new people arriving see nothing they want to assimilate with? Why would you assimilate with a self-loathing culture?
We're seeing the consequences of cultural relativism. Postmodern ideology has been something that has permeated through British universities for 30 or 40 years. Now, some of your viewers might think this is just word salad. What does this mean? Ideas do matter. They really influence how the people who govern us think. And if you believe in postmodern ideology, you believe there's no such thing as objective truth. You believe there's no way of life that is better to another. And that matters, because if you have governments for 30 or 40 years who believe that British culture is not worth preserving, or that Britain is a source of shame, or that British culture is not an achievement, you run into problems when you import into your country large numbers of people from alien cultures and they're not under any compulsion to integrate. And so I think we are in this mess ultimately because of this doctrine of cultural relativism. So what I think those of us who want to try and sort out the mess that Britain and the Western world is in need to begin to articulate that there is something distinctive about Britain and Western culture. And we need to begin to argue that actually the British way of life and the Western way of life is a better way of life than the alternatives. And that if you move to our country, you must integrate and assimilate to that way of life. There are certain things that you must accept. And if you don't accept them, you cannot belong and you cannot be part of the country and the culture. And I think we need to have this conversation. We should have probably had it about 30 years ago, but the media was a monopoly then, and the elite would never have allowed a discussion like the one you and I are about to have. So we need to have it now.
How would you answer the question, what it is, or what is it to be British? What is it? What is it that makes us distinct now?
It's certainly not some facile belief, as Gordon Brown, the former Prime Minister, once used to say, that we believe in fair play. Now, find me a country that doesn't believe in fair play. It's not this idea that, we believe in the rule of law. There are lots of countries and civilized Western countries that believe in the rule of law. Let me start off by saying there's something distinctively Western. If you are a product of Western culture, you believe that no one has an authority of knowledge. If you look at some of the recent migrants living in towns like Bradford and Blackburn, they believe there is an authority of knowledge. They believe that the hadiths and the teachings of a 7th century prophet are so sacrosanct that they cannot be negotiated with. But the Western way is to believe that you and I, Neil, know things today that people didn't know, and that there will be people after us who know things that we don't know. So to be Western is to have a humility of knowledge and to recognize that the way you progress as a society is through the scientific process, through discourse and discovery, and through trial and error. These are not universal values. These are very distinctively Western ideas. And it's why in the West we have things like the common law, which is an evolutionary process. It's why we have a public policy that evolves and adapts to circumstances. These are not universal values. These are Western values. Now, within the branch of what it is to be Western and to have a Western mindset, I would say there are distinctive twigs, if you like, to the branch of Western culture. In Britain, I think we uniquely invented the idea that those who make the law should live under the law, that no one should be above the law. This is evident at the time of Magna Carta. It's certainly evident during the English Civil War, certainly evident in 1776, the idea of no taxation without representation. These are very Anglosphere ideas. I think to be English is to want to subvert people who claim authority over you for a reason. If the BBC, our national broadcaster, was true to that English tradition, they would produce humour that was satirical, and properly satirical, that was mocking the powerful rather than being the sort of left-wing cliches that we so often see produced by the BBC. So the common law is not just a legal reality. I think it is a mindset in England. The idea that there are folk rights, if you like, that are bigger than any parliamentary statute. So I think these are difficult things to define, but they're no less real for that. There is a real English and a British mindset and a British culture. And it's no coincidence that despite being a tiny percentage of the world's population, this tiny little island off the northwest coast of Europe has been so inventive and created so much, from penicillin to the jet engine to the internet, precisely because our culture allows trial and error. It's made us very innovative. It's made us very successful. It's created not just a standard of living that other people would want to come and enjoy. It's created a way of life that others would want to come and enjoy. So I think we need to recognize that there is something uniquely Western, something uniquely British and English, I would say, and that it is not universal. People from different cultures are not instantly interchangeable with what is Western and British, and that if large numbers of people from outside that tradition are going to come here, there are certain things they need to accept, and we can go into the detail of what I think they would need to accept in order for them to be able to remain.
Is it a situation that might be salvaged yet? It doesn't come easily to me, but we're determined to be optimistic when at all possible. But it feels as though we have the very difficult times in front of us, and it seems to me that we simultaneously have the worst of leaders at a time when we need a unique group or a unique individual to find the way to bring all of this together. But is there any sign of that person?
The Western elites have not been serious. They've been on a holiday from history for 30 or 40 years. They've ignored demographic reality. They've ignored the reality of cultural distinctiveness. And we're beginning to reap the consequences of that profound unseriousness. But the old country has been in this position before. Think how grim things must have been in the 1930s. Think how grim things must have been in the 8th century when the Danelaw looked like it would extinguish what it meant to be English. In fact, Englishness was a very nascent idea back then. Think how grim things must have been in the 1970s. It is possible to revive and to recover. We shouldn't look to pin our hopes on an individual, although when the revival and the Thatcher, Churchill, Alfred figure comes, they will certainly be venerated the way those were. It's the ideas we need to revive, and we need to begin by recognizing that we should be free to talk about this. We should be free to talk about the benefits and the costs of immigration, not just as an economic equation, but as a question of cultural compatibility. Are we willing to accept large numbers of people into the country, the second and third and fourth generation of whom will be even less assimilated than the first generation? We need to be able to talk about these things, and we need to be able to produce leaders that would do for culture and integration what Thatcher did for the economy. So it is possible to salvage this. I don't think it's going to happen under the current leadership. I doubt it's going to happen without a fundamentally new settlement. The distribution of power within the British Isles needs to change. An essentially parasitic, bureaucratic elite is behaving in pursuit of their self-interest. They have a series of dogmas and doctrines like cultural relativism that are vacuous and morally and intellectually bankrupt. We certainly need to replace the founding ideology, the underlying ideology of our ruling elite. We possibly need far-reaching constitutional reform as well. But, it is a salvageable problem, but we're going to have to recognize that we need far-reaching fundamental change in the UK in order to do it. And we need to begin by addressing this issue. The falsehood of the ruling elite of cultural relativism will not do any longer. We need to begin to talk about this and discuss it and recognize that we're in a mess because of cultural relativism.
Douglas Carswell, you offer some hope for the future. That's as much as I could have asked for. Time is against me, though. I'll have to wind this up at the moment. Thank you for joining me, Douglas Carswell.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Tom, Britishness, is there still such a thing? And if so, what is it? And do you agree with Douglas Carswell that there is a way out of this, a hope of re-establishing some kind of unity?
As a rational optimist, as you well know, Neil, I always think there's a way out of this. But look, I mean, just on the issue of Britishness, my father was Irish, my mother was Scottish, I was born in England. What I find very versatile, actually, about the notion of Britishness is that you can have multiple identities alongside being British. I think this is one of it's why, for example, people who came after 1948, from the Commonwealth, many of whom had given their lives and had supported us during our darkest hour, why they talk about being British. We're a supranational state.
But fundamentally, doesn't everyone have to agree that there is one way that is better, which would suggest that's why you have come? Ultimately, it's like it would be like a kind of osmosis. You would go in hopes of something better, because you've seen it from the outside, and once you're inside, don't you submit? Maybe not quite so strongly as submit, but accept that the culture and the way of life into which you have inserted yourself is better, and that you should therefore adopt it.
Yeah, that's what I think Douglas has got a point about cultural relativism. I don't agree with that. I do think there's some ideal around multiculturalism, which is about, as you say, it's not about separate cultures living within national boundaries with completely different values and almost a completely different way of life. And actually, the great story, as you know, about Britain over decades has been that we've been one of the more successful countries when it's come to assimilation. For me, it's the issue about values. And the fact is, in our schools, and I see this in education, and you know this as an historian, we don't really anymore have a shared national story across these islands, even though you know and I know that one exists. That isn't taught in our schools. It's not something that people can just pick up easily in conversation because it's not just the cultural relativism. We've got this historical relativism where we've got some aspects now of the curriculum that do the country down, talk the country down. I don't think that's very a good way of teaching future generations. Yes, we've got things wrong as a country in the past, but we've got an incredibly proud history, and a history across these islands that is not just about the political ties, but about the conjugal and familiar ties like you and I both have, which are also really important, as well as those that have come from elsewhere, from across the world.
I would say the challenge is that there is and always has been a story, but that it's been occulted and obfuscated. How often? I quoted it just a couple of weeks ago. George Santayana, who's a Spanish-American philosopher, he said. And he was really referring to the latter days of the British Empire, but he said that not since the ancient Athenians had the world been ruled by such sweet, just, boyish masters. Now, I'm not inviting to say whether that's true or not, but when did you last hear a sentiment like that expressed about the influence that Britain had on other parts of the world? When at the moment all you hear is the negative.
I just think it's extraordinary. You can visit Roman villas, you can visit various archaeological sites around this country, and all the descriptors will talk about, they bought roads and they bought, communications. Whereas the current version and narrative you're hearing in educational sphere is one of, Britain only did bad. We even though we abolished the slave trade, all we did was evil. And that is a really pernicious narrative that needs to end. I think it's a far more nuanced story than that. But overall, and I would argue this very strongly, we have a history that we can be incredibly proud of.
Yeah, and a history and a story that I would have thought that would be nothing less than seductive and attractive, and not something to be subverted for any reason.
Well, I always say we've got a history almost like you couldn't fictionalise it. You couldn't come up with some of the twists and turns that you've seen.
Going to have to get into a break now, Tom. Thank you for that. After the break, lecturer, commentator and thinker Ralph Schulhammer joins me to discuss the concept of moral licensing. It's always an education on the Neil Oliver Show. Stay with me. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. My final guest, as usual, is lecturer, commentator, thinker and friend, Ralph Schulhammer. Good afternoon, Ralph. How are you?
Very good, very good. Good to be on with you, Neil.
Every time I see your face, every time I hear your voice, I feel my spirits lift just a little bit. It's tonic. Now, I believe...
Well, I hope I can keep that up.
I'm sure. I have every faith. I believe that the idea that you want to bring to us, discuss with us this evening, is from psychology. I've been trailing it, the notion of moral licensing. Develop that thesis for us, please.
Well, thank you. Well, I was thinking about this when I was watching the Democratic National Convention. And you had all these people on stage, right? Michelle Obama, you had Jamie Pritzker, Oprah Winfrey. And these were all people, very wealthy, very rich people that were complaining about intergenerational wealth that they themselves have inherited and will also pass on to future generations. But somehow they blamed others who would find themselves in the same conditions. And this is the key principle of moral licensing. What it basically says is that you can complain wrong behavior in others, even though you do the same, but you do it for different reasons. You do it for nobler reasons. You do it for better reasons. And I think this is, and we talk about this so often also on your show, right? When we think about what really distinguishes the elites from the non-elites, because every society has elites. So that per se is not the problem. I think the big problem we have nowadays is that so often the elites demand from us that we either endure policies or pursue certain behaviors or make cutbacks in our lives that they themselves are not willing to do, but they justify it by saying, well, we are just morally better than you. We are just, you are beneath us, we're above you. It's this kind of derogatory treatment of the mass of the people that really bothers, I think, the majority. And this is what I think the people who watch your show, what we usually mean when we talk about the elites. It's not the fact that some people are wealthier than we are. This just happens. This is completely natural. But it is that those who have more then kind of use us as the backdrop for their projection of their virtue, of them trying to feel morally superior to us. And I think this is what really is the big distinction. And you see this in the environmental movement, right, where it is all the John Kerry, Greta Thunberg, they take private jets, but we should, switch to a bicycle. And you see this, I think, in other areas as well.
So, I mean, to some extent, it's do as I say, not as I do, which is a familiar thought. But also, you made while I was listening to you, you made me think about the indulgences that Martin Luther railed against in the Catholic Church. You know, this idea that the rich could buy their way out of purgatory and hell. They could sin, but you could just buy your way out of it, which was clearly an option that was not available to those without the financial resources so to do.
Oh, yes. And I think now you're onto something, because as we know, the Reformation sounds much nicer, but in many ways it was also a revolution. And the two of us have talked about this many times. We would prefer a rebirth, a renewal, and not necessarily a revolution. But I think at some point when people get really upset about this double standard, if you want, I do believe that at some point revolution is the only thing they have available. I mean, you see the same when you look back at the French Revolution, right? A lot of that was going on in France was the perception that the ruling class back in the day, even though that, by the way, objectively was not true, like Louis XVI was not as bad as people say he was, and Marie Antoinette was not as bad as they claimed that she was, but the perception was that they have all these extraordinary, extravagant indulgences, and they do it on the dime of the people, and this is what bothers them. And this is what we feel nowadays as well. Let me give you a very quick example. I looked at the new program from Ed Miliband, the new Secretary for Energy Security and Net Zero, which I think is in itself an Orwellian title. And if you look at the things that he will demand from the British people in order to pursue his ideological goals, he must know that this is going to come under a lot of pain. So the things that he's saying that this will accomplish, he must know that this is factually not true, because basically the British try to repeat the German program. But he believes, that's at least my suggestion, he believes that he can tell the untruth to the British people because he does it in the name of a higher calling, right? In order to save the climate, you can lie to the people. I would even say again, you see this in politics all the time. You see it in the United States. You see it in the debates in the United Kingdom about two-tier policing, right? You can't basically deny reality if you can tell yourself it is for higher and a better calling. And this is a true danger.
Tom, it sounds like the noble lie there. You know, that it's okay to lie. It's okay to pull the wool over the eyes of the public as long as you've got their best interests at heart, and it'll be all right in the end.
I mean, as ever, fascinating talking to you, Ralph. I always look forward to this segment of the show. But in terms of this moral licensing concept then, I mean, how different is that from a concept we also talk about here, virtue signalling? I mean, it sounds very similar concept to me. And as you said, I mean, there's nothing particularly new about elites, about them and us society. But I'm just thinking back to something George Orwell famously said, about political elites here, which is, there's nothing more moderating than for them to feel the pull or the tug from below. So, how do we take on, in effect, as you say, what's become a moral hierarchy now in our whole sort of political and social discourse? How do we change that? Because I've always seen you as a solutions man and not just someone that analyses the problem.
Well, there's a story from the very former French president Charles de Gaulle. And supposedly every time when there was a state event, a banquet or something in France, his wife was doing the bookkeeping on her own because she wanted to make sure that the French people did not pay a livre, a France, too much than they were supposed to. There was also a kind of virtue signaling, but it was a credible virtue signaling, right? It was a kind of, they lived by a virtue, so to speak, that they were signaling. I think the problem that many people have nowadays, you talked with your previous guest about the migration question, and we have the similar situation in Austria and Germany as well. The problem many people have, the same people who say you shouldn't be against migration and all the problems that it causes, whether it's schools, whether it's crime, whether it's the overburdening of the welfare system, right? You can ignore this because they themselves have private insurance. They themselves send their kids to private schools. They themselves live in gated communities where they're isolated from the consequences of the politics that they promote. So I think if I kind of brag with my virtuous life and actually live that virtuous life, I don't think that is so bad. The problem is if I brag with my virtuous life and then I the cost of my virtue, open the borders, for example, is then put on somebody else. I think this is what bothers the people.
Does it, Ralph? Does it come down? I often feel at the moment that so much comes back to the devaluing of the truth. The previous guest that you're talking about talked about moral relativism, and I would say there's only morality. You know, you can't have my morality. There are morals, there are ethics. There's the truth, not my truth, not your truth, not somebody else. There's just the truth. And I sometimes think that what you've alighted on there is the powerful or the rich, or a combination of both. They're always seeking and finding workarounds from what we fundamentally know to be true. You know, we all know that that you can be greedy, but they find ways to justify it because it's okay for them. And we all know that it's wrong to kill, but they continually take us to war because they can see the profit in it. And ultimately, it comes back to, I would say, that the truth is simply a currency, in the same way as all the fiat currencies has been rendered as a currency without any value.
I think that is true. I agree with your assessment. I would be more careful about the concept of moral relativism, because if you look at how they behave, there are many things, but I disagree with a lot of their morals, but I don't think they're relativists. I look, for example, what's currently going on in the UK, kind of the way that Keir Starmer behaves. Basically, if you try to shut people up, to throw them into jail for wrong opinions, whatever that is, that's not relativism, right? The thing is, I think you're correct. What they say does not dovetail with what they do. So they talk about multiculturalism, diversity, and pluralism, when in fact they have exactly one set of values, one set of ideas that they want to see enforced. So I think you're completely right. They gaslight it in the kind of language they use. But are they objectively moral relativists? Are they objectively saying, whatever's your bag, whatever floats your boat, that's fine with me? Well, obviously not, right? That's the whole point about two-tier policing and the two-tier judicial system, that certain things are looked at by the states differently than other things, which I think is a very, very strong sign that it's not relativist. The idea, for example, that the state is just a neutral arbiter, that the state does not kind of give any, does not pass judgment on what a virtuous life is supposed to be. Again, officially, he doesn't. But in his actions, he does, right? If you get arrested for one set of opinions, but not arrested for another set of opinions, that's a moral judgment, I would say.
Yeah, but I think that's what we're saying. I mean, I don't agree with the moral relativism concept, but I do think, you're seeing in our public discourse a kind of moral hierarchy. I mean, you see that, I don't know if you're familiar here with this idea of protected characteristics. So we now have enshrined in our law, in the Human Rights Act, the idea, I mean, it is like, the Orwellian sort of idea that, some animals are more equal than other animals. Some races, genders, have more rights effectively than, say, for example, working class people. I mean, that was ruled out, socioeconomic, as a protected characteristic, even though we know, when we look at the empirical evidence, people born in lower socioeconomic circumstances, in poor postcodes in this country, will not do as well as those who live in a postcode right next to them where it's more affluent. But that's not protected in our social and public policies. What is protected, this is the moral hierarchy point, is this idea that, if you have a certain immutable characteristic as a human being, that is something that is worth protecting.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And I think this, if you want to put it on a slightly kind of more bird's eye view, I think the idea behind this is that what very often comes under the guise of moral relativism is this dominant assumption among the academic and intellectual elite that the West in general and the UK in particular have to atone for the sins of the past that their civilization supposedly has committed. Therefore, everybody who is not part of that civilization, and usually they define it, by skin color, by race, you name it, right? They have to be given advantage over those who were over generations part of that civilization. I mean, there are many great, I would say, British thinkers who make this case. Nigel Biggar, Bruce Gilley, right? There's growing realization of what's going on here. But that's why I always say, I completely agree with you, Tom, that it's not morally relativistic. It just sounds better than to say that our current morality is basically turning against our own civilization. So the distinction between what is good and what is evil is made in the sense that whatever comes from our traditional civilization, call it British, call it the West, we can quibble about these terms, is when in doubt evil, and everything that is non-Western is when in doubt good. And I'm simplifying here, but overall this seems to me is one of the guiding principles we see among our academic and cultural elites.
Ralph, when I listen to you, and Tom, when I listen to you, as I'm listening to this conversation unfold, and you mentioned, Ralph, the DNC, the Democrat National Convention, we fret, we three, and we worry. You look for solutions. We look to philosophy. We look to history. We try to find a way out of this. But I wonder, do you get any sense that those people, those popinjays and peacocks that took to the stage, these billionaires at the DNC, do you think they care? In that way, do you think they ask questions of themselves, of history, or have they just got to a point of power and totalitarianism, really, where they don't need to think, and so they just tell us lies?
No, I think you're right. I mean, the greatest lie, if you want, is the one that even the person who tells it doesn't know it is a lie. And I think this is the big advantage that many of the other side of the debate that we are having are inhabiting, because I think very of them honestly believe what they're saying, right? When you listen, for example, to things, as I said before, that Ed Miliband is saying, things that, not all of them, I mean, there are people smart enough that they just jump on the bandwagon because it's to their advantage. But there is at least a small cadre of people, right, that honestly believe the absurdities that we tend to hear, whether it was the Just Stop Oil movement, whether it was, I would argue, parts, not all of it, but I would say parts of the Black Lives Matter movement. So there's kind of this idea that in fact, really there is, as Tom correctly said, there is this hierarchy, kind of this moral hierarchy that is defined by to which potential victim group you belong. And I think many people honestly believe it. And it's objectively not true, but it's a tremendous source of strength because it gives you confidence, right? If you are so strongly convinced of your worldview that you don't accept anything that runs contrary to it, right? The outcome potentially might be catastrophic, but for you in pushing for your position, it is very, very strong. And look about how contemporary debates are unfolding. There is always one side that says, this is the case. And then the other side is kind of, carefully trying to argue why it might not be the case. And this is because they don't have the same confidence as the other side.
Ralph, you always challenge me. I don't know, does Ralph always challenge you? You always give me fodder for further thought. And every time I listen to you, I think, I cannot wait until I hear the next topic next week. Thank you once again, Ralph Schulhammer. Speak to you soon. You must come to the studio. You've been watching the Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Thank you to all my guests. Especially thank you to you, Tom.
Welcome.
Always a pleasure to have you here. We will hopefully, all things being equal, be back next week